The wind scraped across the barren lot like a rasp, carrying grit that stung the eyes and caught in the throat. He stood there, coat too thin for the season, hat brim pulled low to hide the wear etched into his face. In his pocket, folded twice, lay the last of his money, $10 that felt heavier than gold, though it was scarcely enough to buy feed for the horses. He had not eaten since yesterday, and even the whiskey on his breath was little more than a memory. The town at the edge of the plains was quiet in that way of places that had seen too much suffering to care about one more man's struggle. Paint peeled from the storefronts. Horses shifted restlessly near the post office rail, their breath fogging in the sharp morning air. Somewhere a hammer struck iron, ringing hollow against the silence. He moved slow, like a man already half broken, but inside his chest the ache was not hunger alone. He had written those letters with a trembling hand months before, promising a life he could hardly picture himself. He had written of his ranch, though the fences sagged and the cattle dwindled. He had written of a future, though he was unsure he still believed in one. And she had answered her words inked in neat lines that smelled faintly of lilac when he unfolded them. A woman from far away. A stranger who had agreed to become his wife. The station lay ahead, its wooden boards gray and splintered, the roof bowed under years of sun and snow. No train stood waiting now, only the emptiness left behind. But near the freight office, a figure sat chained, her wrists bound in iron as though she were cargo instead of flesh and breath. A deputy leaned against the post, hat low, rifle across his knees, watching her with the indifference of a hired guard. Her dress was travel-worn, hem caked with dust, bodice torn near the sleeve where rope had rubbed raw. Her face carried that hollow look of someone who had been waiting too long, eyes dulled by distance. And yet when she lifted her gaze, just once, there was a spark that caught him unsteady. It was not hope exactly, but the refusal to die quietly. He stopped short, boots sinking into the dirt. His hand went to his pocket, feeling the worn edges of those bills, his last $10. He had known hardship storms that drowned calves, winters that froze men solid, debts that crushed like stone, but this was something else. To see a woman, his promised bride, shackled like a thief in the open air. To see her waiting, as if the world had already forgotten her name. The deputy's voice broke the stillness. "You the one come for her?" He spat to the side, never rising from his chair. "Mail order freight. Been here 3 days. Cost you extra now, keeping her on chain." The rancher said nothing at first. His throat tightened, and he looked at her instead, at the bruises shadowing her wrists, the way her shoulders hunched not from shame but from endurance. She did not beg. She did not cry out. She simply met his gaze, steady, as if weighing whether he was the kind of man to set her free or let her rot where she sat. He stepped forward, pulled the folded bills from his pocket, and laid them flat on the post office counter. $10, all he had left. The deputy's eyes flicked down, then up again, a slow grin spreading like oil. "Ain't enough." The rancher's jaw tightened. His hands ached to clench but stayed loose at his sides. He thought of the ranch waiting for him, fences broken, cattle thin, the roof leaking over his own bed. He thought of nights alone by the fire, whiskey his only company. And he thought of the promise he had written, words that bound him now more than the iron on her wrists. The deputy shrugged, shifting his weight. "You got more, I'll take it, else she stays." The rancher reached for the bills, but a small sound stopped him. Her voice hoarse, low but steady. "Don't." One word only, but it carried more weight than the deputy's drawl, more weight than the emptiness of his pocket. It was not surrender, but warning. For a long moment, the wind moved around them, stirring dust into small storms. Somewhere, a dog barked, sharp and lonely. The rancher looked at her, then at the guard, then back again. And something shifted inside him, not hope, not yet, but the memory of what it felt like to fight for something worth keeping. His hand fell away from the money. His voice, when it came, was roughened by years of silence. "She's not freight." The deputy laughed, dry as straw. "She's whatever's paid for." The rancher's boots scraped against the wood as he stepped closer, the boards creaking under his weight. His shoulders squared, though his stomach knotted with the risk of it. $10 was all he had, but $10 was not all he was. The woman's eyes did not leave his face, and for the first time he felt seen not as a broke rancher or a desperate fool, but as a man who still had something left to give. He felt the old quiet settle into him, the kind a man learns after too many winters where the blood stays hot but the face goes still. He took off his hat and set it crown down on the counter beside the thin stack of bills, as if laying a tool where it belonged. The brim's sweatband was frayed, and a single horsehair clung to it, pale as a spider thread. He brushed it away with his thumb, slow, unthreatening. "Fetch the station ledger," he said, not looking at the deputy. "Her ticket, the date, the sender's name." The deputy lifted a brow. "What for?" "So I know who I answer to when I speak to the justice," he said. "So I can tell him who chained a woman in public for 3 days and called it policy." Laughter rasped from the deputy's throat, but it thinned at the edges. "Justice rides through when he pleases. Then we will wait," he said. "And while we wait, you can take off those irons and sit her in the shade." The deputy shifted, considering the rifle across his knees. Boots scuffed behind them as a pair of men wandering from the saloon drifted closer to watch. The rancher felt his hunger like a nail under his ribs. He could not afford a fight. He could not afford much of anything. He turned his head a fraction, met the woman's eyes again. He tried to put steadiness in his face, a promise he had no right to give. Her mouth pressed thin. She did not nod, did not plead. She waited, which was its own kind of courage. "Tell you what," the deputy drawled. "You leave those bills. I give you the key. You owe me the rest by Saturday. Fail, I take her back." "Back where?" the rancher asked. "Where money makes rules." The deputy's grin was all gums and dust. He could have cursed. He could have begged. Instead, he lifted the bills, fanned them once, and slid them into his own vest pocket. Then he stepped away from the counter and crossed the short space between the deputy and the woman, each footfall a test of the boards. He stopped just short of the rifle's muzzle. Up close, the iron on her wrists was pitted and red-brown, the lock cheap and mean. Rope burn marbled her skin. He could smell railroad smoke in her hair and the ghost of lilac that clung to nothing now. "There is a blacksmith 2 doors down," he said. "He will open those for a handshake." The deputy's mouth flattened. "Try it?" The rancher breathed once through his teeth, slow. He had learned this rhythm branding calves, gentling green colts, facing weather he could not change. He let his hands show empty. He spoke as if to a skittish mare. "You will not be blamed. The ledger shows she was delivered. I am here. I sign my name." Something old and tired flickered behind the deputy's eyes, some memory of a sister sent west for a better chance that never came, or perhaps only a long hunger for respect. He pushed the rifle back in its rest and stood, stretching his spine. "Sign then," he said, shoving a blotched sheet forward. "Name here. And if you run me in circles, I swear I will chain the both of you to that post until the moon falls." He took the splintered pen and wrote his name slow, each letter like a fence post set straight. His hand shook once and stilled. When he finished, he laid the pen down and did not step away. "The key," he said. The deputy hesitated, then dug in his pocket and produced a small iron shape. The rancher did not reach for it. "Hand it to her." A small twitch tugged at the deputy's jaw, but he did as asked. The woman looked at the key a heartbeat as if it were a trick. Then she lifted her bound wrists without a word. The lock coughed rust and clicked. The chain slid like a dead snake from her lap to the boards. The sound was small, yet it carried, and a stillness came over the few bystanders, the kind that always follows something mean being undone. She rubbed the raw circles at her wrists and drew a breath that seemed to enter her bones. He picked up his hat and held it rather than put it on, not wanting to hide his face from her. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I can," she said. Her voice scraped thin. She glanced toward the freight shed where a single carpet bag slouched like an old dog. He took it without asking permission and set it gently at her feet. The deputy cleared his throat. "Saturday," he said, "before sundown. We will be here," the rancher said. He did not know how. He only knew he would. They stepped down from the platform together. The street heat rose in faint ripples, carrying the sense of coal smoke and bread and the bitter tang of horse. He offered his arm, not chivalrous, only steady, and after a pause, she took it. Her grip was careful, as if learning the weight of a person could be trusted. They moved past the smithy, where sparks leapt like bright fish in a dark stream. The smith looked up, saw the raw marks on her wrists, and gave a single nod that struck like benediction. At the pump, he worked the handle while she cupped her hands and drank. Water spilled down her chin, and she let it, eyes closed, throat working. He wanted to wipe the drops away with his thumb, but instead he held the handle and kept the water coming, steady as rain on hard ground. When she finished, he waited until she met his gaze. "My place is a day's ride," he said. "It is not much. Fences need mending. Roof leaks. But there is shade at midday, and a creek that keeps running even when the world forgets itself." Her mouth trembled once, and steadied. "I have known worse." "We will buy food before we go," he said. He looked down at his empty hands, and almost smiled at the foolishness of that promise. "We will find a way." The wind lifted the fringe of her torn sleeve. She nodded, not in surrender but in pact. They turned toward the mercantile, side by side, thin shadows threading through the dust. The store smelled of leather, flour, and lamp oil, the mingled sense of survival. Inside, shelves leaned under the weight of sacks and tins, though the space felt emptier than it once had, as if prosperity had slipped out the door and never returned. He kept his hat in his hand, head bowed slightly, not from shame but from a weariness that clung like smoke. The shopkeeper, a gaunt man with spectacles perched low, looked up from his ledger. His eyes flicked to the woman, lingering a heartbeat too long on the raw welts at her wrists, before shifting back to the rancher. "What'll it be?" he asked, voice dry as paper. He hesitated. He had $10 no longer. His pockets were hollow, his debts heavier than any saddlebag. He glanced at her, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted despite the fraying of her dress. She carried herself like someone who had walked through storms and still found the horizon worth reaching. "Bread," he said finally. "Flour. Beans. Enough for 2 days' ride." The shopkeeper studied him. "You have coin?" The rancher's throat tightened. He reached into his vest, fingers brushing the pocket where the bills had lain. Empty. He met the shopkeeper's eyes with a steadiness that bordered on defiance. "I have a ranch a day west. Fences down, cattle thin, but the land still holds. I'll settle when the herd fattens again." A silence stretched. The woman moved closer, her presence a quiet anchor. Then, softly, she spoke, the first words she had offered beyond necessity. "I can sew. I can mend. If you allow, I can pay with my hands." The shopkeeper blinked, as if startled by the sound of her voice. He studied her, then the rancher. A long sigh left him. "Take the bread. The rest waits." He slid a loaf across the counter, hard, crusted, but fresh. "Bring me beef when the winter's over. I'll hold you to it." The rancher inclined his head. "You will have it." He took the loaf, feeling its weight, as if it were more than bread, more than charity. He broke it in half and handed her a piece. She accepted without hesitation, tearing off a corner, chewing slow, savoring every crumb. He ate too, the dry crust cutting his gums, but the taste filled a hollow that had gone too long unfed. Outside, the day was sliding toward dusk. Long shadows stretched across the street, spilling like ink. A wagon clattered by, carrying timber, and a family hunched together against the dust. He watched them go, then turned to her. "We'll leave at first light," he said. "The horses can make the ride in a day if we press." Her eyes lifted to the horizon, where the plains opened wide, sky falling endless over the land. "I am ready." They found lodging in the back room of the livery, a space that smelled of hay and old sweat. The rancher spread his coat on the floor, motioning for her to take the cot. She shook her head, voice steady, though soft. "We will share the ground tonight." He said nothing, but in the quiet that followed, he laid beside her, a respectful distance between. The horses shifted in their stalls beyond the wall, hooves tapping like a slow heartbeat. Through the cracks in the roof, stars began to prick the sky, cold and indifferent, yet infinite. Sleep did not come quick. He stared at the beams above, listening to the cadence of her breath. For the first time in years, the sound eased the silence that usually pressed down on him at night. He thought of the chains falling from her wrists, of the look in her eyes when she first met his. Not gratitude, not even relief, but recognition, as if they both carried the same scar, carved by loneliness and the weight of promises broken. She turned slightly, her voice threading through the dark. "Why did you come for me?" His answer came rough, as though pulled from deep in the chest. "Because you were waiting, and I was tired of watching the world pass me by." The quiet folded back around them. Outside, the wind rattled the loose boards, but inside there was a fragile warmth. She did not press him further, and he did not try to explain more than he could. They lay in silence, two strangers bound not by vows or law, but by the simple fact that neither had turned away. When dawn came pale and sharp, he rose and saddled the horses. She tied her hair back with a strip torn from her hem, shoulders squared, eyes set toward the horizon. Together they rode out of town, the dust rising behind them, the road stretching wide and unbroken before. The prairie spread before them like an ocean of grass, rippling under the breath of the morning wind. The sky hung vast and pale, streaked with thin clouds that promised no rain. He rode with his shoulders hunched, as though trying to shield her from the emptiness ahead, though he knew the land was too broad to guard. She sat the saddle straight-backed, her borrowed reins steady in her hands. For someone new to the West, she did not flinch at the open miles. Hours passed with only the sound of hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high. He watched her out of the corner of his eye, noting the way her dress bunched where it had torn, the raw lines still visible at her wrists. Hunger and weariness weighed on her, yet she did not complain. Once, when the horse stumbled on a loose stone, she only patted its neck and whispered something low, a thread of comfort in a world that offered little. By noon, the heat rose sharp, pressing down on their shoulders. He guided them toward a stand of cottonwoods near a shallow creek. The horses drank greedily, and she knelt to cup water in her palms, splashing her face. The cold drops clung to her skin, catching sunlight like small gems. He turned away, giving her the dignity of privacy, but her resilience carved itself deeper into him with every moment. They ate the last of the bread beneath the shade. She chewed slowly, savoring each mouthful, while he watched the water slip over stones worn smooth. Silence stretched between them, but it was not the hollow kind. It was the silence of two lives brushing against one another, still strangers yet tethered by necessity. At length, she spoke, her voice hushed. "I was told marriage was escape, a new beginning. They did not tell me about chains." His chest tightened. He picked a blade of grass, twisting it between rough fingers. "I was told land was freedom. A ranch, cattle, soil to call mine. They did not tell me how fast it all could wither." Her gaze found his, steady. "And yet, we are still here." He nodded once, not trusting words. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of dust and wild sage. They rode again as the shadows lengthened, the sun sinking low. By the time his ranch came into view, a weathered cabin with one leaning fence and a roof patched in rusted tin, the light had turned amber, painting the world in weary gold. The land stretched barren in places, but the creek glimmered, and a few cattle lifted their heads from the grass, thin yet alive. He felt shame crawl up his spine, showing her so little after all the letters he had written. But when she dismounted, she walked the yard slow, her hand trailing along the fence post as if testing the weight of it. She looked at the cabin not with scorn, but with something quieter recognition, perhaps, of another soul that had endured more than it had been given. "It stands," she said softly. "That is enough." Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. He lit a lantern, its glow throwing shadows against the rough-hewn walls. She set her bag on the small table, then turned to him, her face caught half in light, half in shadow. "You built this yourself?" He nodded. "Board by board. Years back, when I thought sweat was enough to hold the world together." Her eyes traced the beams overhead, the uneven planks, the patched floor. Then she met his gaze. "It takes more than sweat. It takes staying." The words struck deeper than he expected, a truth he had avoided naming. He busied himself with the stove, setting kindling to flame, though his hands betrayed their tremor. Behind him, he heard her moving, unpacking, folding, arranging what little she had as if to stitch her life into the space. When the fire caught, warmth spread through the cabin. He sat across from her, the lantern between them, the silence thick yet tender. For the first time in years, he felt the walls did not press inward but held steady, as if waiting to be filled. She looked at him, her voice quiet but certain. "We begin here." He bowed his head, not in defeat, but in reverence. The night settled outside, stars scattered wide, while inside two strangers sat at a table and began to carry the fragile weight of tomorrow together. The night air pressed close around the cabin, carrying the smell of sage and damp earth. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices sharp against the stillness. He lay on his cot, staring at the low rafters, the ache in his bones louder than the wind outside. Sleep evaded him. His mind wandered to the day, to the clatter of chains, to her eyes steady on his as if she had measured him and found some use in what remained. Across the room she rested on a pallet made from folded blankets, her breathing slow, but not deep. He could tell by the faint shift of her body that she too hovered at the edge of sleep without crossing over. The lantern had burned low, casting only a thin glow, yet he could see the curve of her shoulder, the hair falling loose over her face. She had crossed miles of rail and desert, endured indignity, hunger, and waiting, yet here she was, under his roof. He thought of the lies, half-truths, really, that he had penned in his letters. Words about a ranch thriving, cattle multiplying, a home with room enough for dreams. What she had walked into was a place barely holding together, a man with nothing left but $10, and the stubborn refusal to fall. Shame sat heavy in him, but alongside it, something else stirred, something like the fragile edge of hope. When dawn broke, he rose early, moving quietly to the stove. The fire crackled, and he brewed coffee thin enough to see through. She joined him not long after, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled to the elbow. She washed her face at the basin, then looked about the cabin with the calm eye of someone cataloging what could be mended. "I will clean today," she said simply, her voice hoarse but certain. He nodded, offering her the tin cup of coffee. She sipped without flinching at the bitterness. "I'll ride fence," he answered. "See where it's fallen worst." So it began. The slow work of two lives intertwining not through declarations but through labor. He walked the perimeter of the pasture, hammer and wire slung across his shoulder. She swept the dirt floor, scrubbed the table, patched a tear in the single curtain that hung by the window. When he returned at midday, sweat cutting lines through the dust on his face, she had bread rising by the stove, made from the last of the flour. They ate together, saying little, the silence filled with the rhythm of work and breath. Yet he noticed the way she met his eyes now without hesitation, as though the ground beneath her feet had steadied, however fragile. Days blurred into one another. She learned to carry water from the creek, to mend harness straps, to cook beans until they softened in the pot. He found himself speaking more than he had in years, small things, stories of storms survived, of calves lost and found, of the old mare that knew the land better than any man. She listened, not with politeness, but with attention that made the words matter. One evening, as the sky turned red behind the cottonwoods, she stood outside watching the cattle drift toward water. He joined her, the air cool on their faces. "It is harsh land," she said, her voice low, "but it is honest." He studied her profile against the burning horizon. "It takes more than a man to tame it." She turned her head, eyes catching his. "Then we will not tame it. We will endure it." Something tightened and released inside him at those words, as though she had spoken the truth of his own marrow. For the first time, the future did not seem like a weight pressing him into the ground, but a long road he might actually walk with her beside him. The ranch was still broken, debts still looming, but the silence between them no longer felt empty. It held the shape of something forming, fragile and stubborn. And as the last light fell, he realized that, though he had begun this journey with nothing more than $10, he had found something no currency could measure. The weeks unfolded like a slow-moving river, each day carving new grooves into the life they were building. Morning chores bled into long afternoons of mending, hauling, tending to cattle that grew thinner before the grass returned. At night, they sat by the stove, her stitching in her lap, His boots stretched toward the fire. Words were few, yet their absence no longer stung. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, a silence that said, "I see you, and you are not alone here." She learned quickly how to balance a bucket on her hip, how to coax the mule into harness, how to pull splinters from her palms without flinching. When the roof leaked during a sudden storm, she held boards steady while he nailed them down, rainwater soaking through her dress. She did not complain. Instead, she looked at him with rain dripping from her lashes and said, almost wryly, "At least it is water, not fire." That night, after the storm had passed, they sat in the dim cabin with a single lantern glowing. He found himself telling her about his father, a man who had taught him to read the sky, to trust the land even when it betrayed you. His father had died one bitter winter, leaving the ranch and its debts to a son not yet hardened enough for the burden. He had carried that shame for years, but as he spoke, her eyes did not hold pity. They held recognition, as if she, too, knew the shape of loss that never quite healed. In turn, she spoke of her own leaving, a small town back east where work had dried up, where women were expected to marry or fade into nothing. She had answered his letter not out of romance, but out of survival. "I thought chains would be lighter than hunger," she whispered, her voice raw. "I was wrong, but I did not expect someone would cut them." He had no answer for that. He only reached across the narrow table and placed his calloused hand over hers, a gesture small and trembling, yet it carried the weight of a vow neither had spoken. She did not pull away. By the time autumn came, the ranch bore small signs of mending. Fences straightened, a calf born strong, a field cleared for planting come spring. Neighbors, once distant, began to stop by curious about the woman who carried herself with quiet strength. Some brought supplies, others only gossip. But whispers carried too, that a woman who had arrived in chains could not be trusted, that a rancher too broke to buy freedom had no business keeping a wife. One evening, he returned from the mercantile with his jaw set tight, the words of a rival rancher still ringing in his ears. "Bought her like stock," the man had sneered, "and she'll run the first chance she gets." When he told her, shame thick in his throat, she did not flinch. Instead, she stood tall in the doorway, lantern light behind her, casting her in a halo of shadow and flame. "Let them talk," she said. "They only see what chains made of me. You saw what I could be after they fell." Something in him broke open then, not in weakness, but in release. He stepped forward, closing the distance, and for the first time pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss born of hunger, but of recognition. Two lives colliding, not in rescue or ownership, but in a fragile choice to endure together. Outside, the prairie stretched endless, the wind carrying the cries of coyotes and the rustle of grass. Inside, for the first time, the cabin felt like a home. Winter came hard that year, the kind that pressed against the windows and howled through the eaves like a beast shut out in the cold. Snow fell thick across the prairie, burying the fences he had mended, frosting the creek until it whispered beneath ice. The cattle huddled in lean clusters, their breath ghosting the air. Every morning he rose before the light, breaking trail with numb hands, carrying hay to beasts that stared at him with the same dull hunger he carried inside. She worked beside him. Her skirts gathered frost at the hem. Her fingers cracked and bled from hauling water, from chopping wood until her shoulders shook. Yet she never asked to be spared. When the storm winds drove them inside, she kept the fire alive, baked bread from the last of the flour, sewed patches on coats until her eyes blurred. He watched her by the firelight, hair falling loose, face pale but unyielding. More than once, he thought she was stronger than the timbers that held the cabin upright. At night, when the wind clawed the shutters and the roof groaned, she would lie close enough that he could hear her steady breathing. Sometimes their hands touched in the dark, and neither of them pulled away. Words were scarce, but the warmth of her presence was enough to keep despair from swallowing him whole. One night, when the storm rattled the very bones of the house, she spoke into the darkness. "Do you regret it?" He turned his head, though he could not see her face. "What?" "Taking me from that platform." Her voice trembled, though not with fear. With something deeper uncertainty, perhaps, or the fragile hope of belonging. The silence stretched, filled only by the groan of timbers and the rush of wind. At last he said, "Number not once. I regret only that I had nothing better to give you." Her breath caught. Then her hand found his, small and raw from work, and she laced her fingers through his. "You gave me more than I asked. You gave me a place to stand." The days dragged, but slowly the worst of winter passed. By early spring, the snow melted, turning the yard to mud and coaxing thin shoots of green from the thawing ground. Together they walked the fences again, side by side, setting posts back into place. She laughed once, a sound rare and startling, when the calf broke free and she chased it through the mud, her skirts flying, her cheeks flushed. He had not heard laughter in his house in years, and it struck him like sunlight after endless dark. But the world did not leave them unchallenged. Word reached them that the deputy who had held her in chains still claimed a debt unpaid. He would ride out, he said, by the first thaw, to collect what he was owed or take her back into custody. The rancher's jaw hardened when the news came. He sat long that night, staring at the flames, his hand curling into fists. She stood at the table, sewing by lantern light, her voice calm, though the words cut sharp. "He will not chain me again, not while I breathe." The thaw came. He looked up, meeting her steady gaze, and something in him steeled. The time for enduring was ending. Now came the test of whether what they had built, fragile, stubborn, forged through hunger and storms, could withstand the weight of the past pressing hard upon them. The thaw came with mud thick as tar, swallowing wagon wheels and boots alike. The air smelled of wet earth and new grass, but the promise of spring carried little comfort with the deputy's shadow looming. Each morning the rancher rose earlier, mending fences with a vengeance, his hammer striking sharp into the wood as though every blow drove back the threat. She worked beside him, her palms blistered, her dress hem streaked with soil, but her eyes steady, unflinching. Neighbors passed along whispers. Some said the deputy would not dare ride this far with only his pride for armor. Others swore he carried papers stamped with law, proof enough to drag her back east. The rancher listened, said little, but inside him a storm brewed. He had carved a life from dust with her, fragile though it was, and he would not surrender it to the greed of a petty man. On the third morning after the thaw, hooves beat the earth beyond the creek. The sound rolled closer, steady as a drum. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, the boards creaking under his weight. She stood just inside the door, her face pale yet resolved, as if chains could no longer frighten her now that she had known freedom. The deputy rode alone, his horse lathered from the ride, his face set in a sneer. He swung down, boots splashing in the mud. "I've come for what's owed," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. The rancher said nothing at first. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, their bare branches rattling like bones. At last he spoke, his voice low, roughened by the weight of long silence. "There's nothing here for you, not money, not her." The deputy's hand brushed the butt of his pistol. "Law says otherwise." "She is no freight," the rancher said, the words firm enough to anchor in the air. "And the only law that stands on this land is the law we make with our hands." The deputy's grin cracked, sharp as a knife. "Then you'd best be ready to bleed for it." The moment stretched taut. Birds startled from the trees, their wings cutting the silence. Then, before the deputy could draw, the rancher raised his rifle not in haste, but with the calm of a man who had made peace with risk. His aim did not waver. "You'll ride back to town," he said. "You'll tell them the debt is settled, and if you set foot here again, the earth itself will remember the weight of you." For a long beat, the deputy held his ground. Mud clung to his boots, breath misting in the cool air. But something in the rancher's face, something carved from hunger, storms, and the hard endurance of love, made him falter. With a curse, he spat into the mud, mounted, and wheeled his horse toward the horizon. The silence that followed was heavier than the confrontation itself. The rancher lowered the rifle, his arms trembling now that the moment had passed. Behind him, she stepped onto the porch, her hand finding his shoulder, grounding him. "He is gone," she whispered. "For now," he said, though his voice carried more strength than doubt. He turned to her, meeting her eyes, and in that moment no law nor chain could touch them. They stood together, the prairie stretching endless, the cabin behind them still fragile, the future uncertain. But in their silence was a vow. Whatever storms rose, whatever debts came due, they would endure not apart, but bound by the choice they had both made. The sun broke through the clouds then, light falling across the yard, glinting on the damp earth like a blessing. She laced her fingers with his, and for the first time, he believed the land might yet hold something worth keeping.